The number the HOA wanted the judge to remember was 9.7 kilovolts. Allison Price had repeated it 3 times in 20 minutes. The first time she said it carefully. The second time she said it with concern. By the third time, she said it the way people say black mold at a home inspection. Quietly, but with the clear expectation that everyone should begin calculating the cost of evacuation. Northridge Compliance's consultant, Martin Cole, sat in the witness chair with the complete test report open in front of him. Priya Shah, my attorney, asked whether his meter had been calibrated. Yes. Whether the recorded peak reading was 9.7 kilovolts under the test load stated in his report. Yes. Whether the report was an accurate record of the test his company had performed. Yes. At the HOA's table, Allison settled back in her chair. She had the expression of someone who had successfully assembled a piece of furniture and had not yet noticed the 3 screws left on the carpet. Priya did not argue about voltage. That was important. 9,700 volts sounds dramatic because it is a large number, and courts, like normal people, tend to prefer smaller numbers when electricity is involved. But an electric wildlife fence does not deliver household current continuously. It sends brief controlled pulses. Voltage mattered, but so did the load, pulse energy, duration, grounding, installation, and one other detail that had somehow received less attention than the font on the HOA's exhibit. Priya placed one finger near the bottom of the page. "Mr. Cole, would you read the controller serial associated with that measurement?" He leaned forward. EF7712. I knew that number. Allison did too, although it took her a second longer. That second was the reason we had spent 6 weeks not telling her what we knew. 6 months earlier, my biggest problem had been deer. I had planted 8 young fruit trees behind my house, 2 peach, 2 apple, a pear, 2 plum, and 1 apricot that had arrived with a care sheet longer than the paperwork for my mortgage. The apricot required full sun, good drainage, careful pruning, and apparently a personality compatible with disappointment. The deer liked the peach trees best. They did not eat them so much as conduct quality testing. One morning I found the upper branches stripped, hoof prints pressed into the mulch, and an irrigation emitter pulled loose and lying 6 feet away. The deer had left behind a generous sample of their own inspection material. I was 58 and recently retired from supervising quality control at a calibration laboratory. For 31 years, my job had been to make sure instruments measured what people claimed they measured. Retirement had not cured me of that habit. I still photographed model plates before installing equipment. I labeled spare parts. I once returned a kitchen scale because it disagreed with a certified weight by 11 grams. My daughter said this was why I had few spontaneous adventures. I told her spontaneous adventures were usually what happened when nobody checked the equipment. The deer damage was irritating. The loose dogs were different. Twice, 2 large mixed-breed dogs came through the rear of my yard from the greenbelt. The second time, they chased my spaniel, Benny, beneath the deck. Benny was 13, mostly deaf, and shaped like a loaf of bread that had given up on symmetry. He escaped without injury, but afterward he refused to cross the lawn unless I went first. I considered a privacy fence. It would have blocked the orchard from sunlight along one side, cost more, and looked heavier than the problem required. The county permitted pulsed animal control fencing in our semi-rural residential district if it met setback, visibility, warning sign, and controller requirements. The HOA standards did not prohibit it, so I called Safeline Agricultural Systems. The technician, Luis, walked the lot with me and recommended a low-output residential wildlife configuration, thin black strands set well inside my property line, clearly marked, properly grounded, and connected to a listed pulsed energizer. It was meant to persuade deer and dogs to reconsider their plans, not launch them into neighboring counties. That distinction later became difficult to communicate to people who had already chosen the phrase electrical perimeter. Safeline was the only specialist within an hour that regularly handled wildlife fencing. I already knew the company's white truck because it visited our neighborhood twice a year. The HOA had its own electric fence around the maintenance yard near the back entrance. The yard stored landscaping fuel, chemicals, power equipment, and several pallets of seasonal decorations, including a plywood snowman that looked judgmental even in July. The perimeter had been installed after repeated thefts. Nobody objected to that fence. It sat behind hedges and protected HOA property, which is the suburban equivalent of diplomatic immunity. Luis mounted my controller inside a weatherproof cabinet near the garage. The unit had a gray housing with a green status light and the serial EF8841. Before closing the cabinet, he photographed the plate, recorded the controller configuration, tested the grounding, measured the output under the prescribed load, and gave me the installation certificate. "Keep this," he said. "I keep manuals for discontinued smoke detectors." Then I believe this document has found the right home. As he packed up, I mentioned that the controller looked like the one at the HOA yard. "Same product family," he said. "Different setup. Theirs is built for a longer isolated perimeter and heavier load. Yours is for this." He gestured at my orchard, where Benny was sniffing a bucket with the concentration of a federal investigator. That was all. No ominous music played. Nobody circled a serial number in red. It was simply a normal detail about two systems installed by the same local company. Normal details are useful that way. They do not attract attention until somebody needs them to tell the truth. Before installation, I submitted the site plan to the architectural committee. It showed the fence line, distance from the lot boundary, controller location, warning signs, and the gate shutoff. I included SafeLine's product sheet and the county guidance. The community manager, Ellen, emailed 11 days later. Approved as submitted under current exterior improvement standards. I saved the email as a PDF because retirement had not made me reckless. For almost 3 months, nothing happened. The thin strands were difficult to see from the street. The deer stopped trimming my trees without permission. Benny returned to the lawn. The apricot produced 6 leaves, which by apricot standards appeared to be a major personal breakthrough. Then Allison Price came through on an architectural inspection drive. Allison chaired both the HOA board and the architectural committee. Combining those roles was efficient in the same way combining a referee and a team captain is efficient. She was not irrational. She was organized, energetic, and deeply committed to the belief that visual consistency could solve problems normally assigned to diplomacy. She stopped at the curb while I was watering. "Is that electrified?" "Pulsed wildlife fence," I said. "Approved in March." She looked past me toward the orchard. "It reads as industrial." That was the first description. 4 days later, the violation notice did not mention industrial appearance. It called the fence an immediate electrical hazard and ordered removal within 72 hours. Apparently, aesthetics had gone home, changed clothes, and returned as public safety. I replied the same afternoon. I attached the approval, installation certificate, controller model, and county requirements. Then I asked 5 questions. What rule did the HOA contend I had violated? Had anyone measured my system? If so, where was the measurement taken? What instrument and test load were used? Who had witnessed the test? The response came from Allison, not Ellen. The board is not obligated to disclose its investigative methods before correction of an obvious hazard. It was an impressive sentence. It had authority, mystery, and no answer. The deadline remained. I called Priya Shah, an attorney who had handled a drainage dispute for a friend. At our first meeting, she read the approval and asked whether the fence could injure someone. "Any equipment can be unsafe if it is defective or installed incorrectly," I said. "That's why you test the actual equipment." "Can we have it tested again?" "Yes. And we should invite them." I drafted the protocol that evening. A neutral licensed inspector would conduct the test. Both parties could attend. Before any reading, We would photograph the controller serial, meter serial, calibration label, wiring, grounding, and test location. The inspector would record peak voltage at a stated resistance, pulse energy, pulse interval, shut-off behavior, signs, and setbacks. Both sides would receive the raw results. Priya removed 2 paragraphs in which I had explained measurement uncertainty. They do not need a seminar, she said. It was a short seminar. It had footnotes. She sent the proposal. Allison refused it the next morning. The association will not participate in an owner-designed test intended to validate an obvious hazard. That refusal changed the problem for me. If she truly believed my fence produced an emergency condition, a witness-neutral test was the fastest way to prove it. Refusing did not prove dishonesty. People refuse sensible proposals for all kinds of reasons, including pride, expense, and the ancient human fear that a neutral person may turn out to be neutral. But it told me the HOA's confidence was not attached to a measurement of my equipment. I photographed EF 8841 again, downloaded the approval from the portal, preserved the email headers, and asked Safeline for its original service file. Priya noticed. You think they tested something else? I think they do not want to tell us what they tested. That was not yet an answer. It was a direction. 2 days later, the HOA sent what it called a technical substantiation. It was 1 page from Northridge Compliance. At the top was a chart showing a loaded comparison reading of 9.7 kilovolts. Below the chart were 2 photographs of my fence. A yellow box said, "Elevated output requires immediate correction. 9.7 kilovolts is 9,700 volts. Written out, it looks even more eager to cause trouble. The number itself was plausible. Pulsed wildlife energizers commonly operate at several thousand volts, and some legitimate units approach or exceed 10 kilovolts depending on the test condition. That is why a competent safety evaluation does not stop at the largest number on the page. It identifies the controller, load, energy per pulse, pulse duration, grounding, and installation. This page did not. The chart had no site address. The controller serial was absent. The test load field had been cropped below its heading. There was no pulse energy result, witness list, work order scope, appendix, or original photograph linking the meter to my fence. The 2 photographs of my yard were real. One had been taken from the sidewalk. But placing a real photograph beside a real number does not create a real measurement. If it did, I could put my driver's license photo beside an Olympic sprint time and improve my mornings considerably. Priya asked whether 9.7 kilovolts could come from my controller. I cannot tell from this page. Could it be unsafe? I cannot tell from this page. Could it be perfectly normal? I cannot tell from this page. She looked at me. I am beginning to understand why people found your laboratory reports frustrating. Uncertainty is not frustrating. Unlabeled uncertainty is frustrating. She turned the page over. The back was blank. The HOA had supplied a conclusion without the information required to reach it. It had also supplied no equipment identity. I still did not accuse Allison of substituting a test. At that point, she might have possessed a complete report that answered every question. If I announced the weakness too early, she could correct the filing, order a real inspection, or retreat to a different rule. Instead, we asked for the entire report. The HOA did not provide it. It filed for emergency removal. The petition described my fence as an imminent danger to residents, delivery workers, children, pets, and community invitees, a category broad enough to include nearly everyone except deer. The HOA also recorded an assessment lien for $4,850 in fines and administrative charges. Priya explained that the emergency label could get us a hearing quickly. Quickly is their advantage, she said, only if the claim stays vague. We had 12 days. I did not spend them posting angry messages in the neighborhood group. That forum was already occupied by a debate about whether recycling bins could remain visible until 8 p.m. It was not ready for pulse energy analysis. Instead, Priya and I reduced the dispute to one factual statement. The HOA had placed Exhibit 4, the Northridge page, beside photographs of my fence, and told the court the reading proved my system was dangerous. We needed the association to commit to that representation before it saw why the missing identity mattered. Priya drafted a request for admission. Admit that the 9.7 kilovolt reading identified in Exhibit 4 was obtained from the electric fence system installed at Daniel Reyes's property. It was one sentence. I had spent a career watching people hide uncertainty inside 50-page reports. There was something almost beautiful about giving them one sentence and only two useful answers. If the HOA denied it, the emergency exhibit lost its connection to my property. If it admitted it, the equipment identity became decisive. Allison chose admitted. She did not answer immediately. The HOA had 30 days, although its emergency petition insisted my fence could not safely survive another weekend. On day 28, Priya received a 6-page response containing objections to nearly everything except the weather. The association objected that some requests were burdensome, others were vague, and one phrase could be interpreted in more than one way by a person determined to interpret it in more than one way. But beneath the objections, the answer to our single factual question remained one word: admitted. Priya called me. They committed. Did Allison sign it? Their attorney signed it after consultation with the association. Better. An admission from an angry board chair might later be described as confusion. An admission reviewed by counsel was harder to misplace. It did not prove the reading was false. It proved what the HOA claimed the reading represented. I printed the response and placed it behind the cropped report. For years at the laboratory, we had used travelers, documents that followed an instrument through every stage of a job. If a pressure gauge moved from intake to cleaning to calibration, the traveler moved with it. Lose the traveler and you did not have a calibrated gauge. You had a metal object with an interesting personal history. Exhibit 4 had no traveler. Now the admission gave it one destination: my property. The complete Northridge file would either support that destination or show that the HOA had attached the wrong label. Priya asked why I was so certain the serial would matter. I'm not. You sound certain. I'm certain that identity matters. I don't know what the identity will show. That distinction was less exciting than confidence, but it kept us from building the defense around a twist we had not earned. Priya wanted to lead with the rule problem. The architectural standards available on the portal when I installed the fence contained no energized fence prohibition, and my written approval was difficult to explain away. That may be enough, she said. It gives them room to call this a prospective safety correction. And the measurement? They chose the measurement as the emergency. Make them own it. That was my contribution to the case. Priya understood the law. I understood what happened when someone wrote a conclusion before identifying the instrument. Our document request was deliberately narrow: the complete Northridge report, original images, controller serial, meter serial and calibration record, stated test load, work order, test location, witness record, and related vendor invoices. The production arrived 4 days before the hearing. It arrived at 4:43 on a Friday afternoon, which is the traditional delivery time for documents someone hopes will become Monday's problem. There were 312 pages. Most were routine: engagement emails, billing entries, calibration certificates, duplicated photographs, and invoices for ordinary maintenance. Priya divided the file into legal relevance. I divided it into things with serial numbers and things pretending not to need one. We found the full Northridge report on page 186. The page used in Exhibit 4 was page 2. On its own, it looked alarming. Page 1 identified the assignment. Page 3 identified the equipment. Page 4 stated the test condition and limitation. The HOA had selected the only page capable of traveling without adult supervision. The meter certificate was valid. The consultant had done his job correctly. The full report did not call my property dangerous because it did not report a test at my property. The appendix identified the tested controller as EF7712. Mine was EF8841. The work order described the assignment as a representative output demonstration using existing association equipment. A site field identified the HOA maintenance yard. The full page stated that access to the homeowner installation had not been provided and that no conclusion about its output could be made without direct testing. Northridge had written an accurate report. Someone had removed the parts that made it accurate. I read the serial again. EF7712 was familiar, but memory was not evidence. We searched the HOA's invoices. 3 years earlier, Safeline had billed the association for installing a higher output controller at the maintenance yard. Equipment serial EF7712. Priya sat very still. Their dangerous test is from their fence. Their voltage test is from their fence, I said. Whether it is dangerous still depends on the rest of the test. You are correcting me at a very satisfying moment. It is how I show affection. She wanted to send Allison a letter immediately. I wanted Allison to authenticate Exhibit 4 first. If we warned her, she could withdraw the exhibit, say it had been attached only as an illustration, and pivot entirely to architectural authority. But she had already admitted in writing that it was a measurement of my installed system. At the hearing, she would have to choose between abandoning the emergency claim or defending the exhibit. We verified the invoice with Safeline. We obtained the original installation certificate for EF8841. Then we scheduled the neutral inspection under the same protocol the HOA had refused. Luis was not our neutral inspector. That was deliberate. He had installed my system and could authenticate his records, but using a different qualified professional, removed an easy complaint about loyalty. The inspector, Grace Morgan, arrived at 8 on Tuesday morning with a meter case, a clipboard, and the calm expression of someone accustomed to being watched by people who hoped electricity would take their side. Before touching the fence, she photographed EF8841. She photographed her meter and calibration label. She recorded the weather, soil condition, wiring, and test points. I stayed on the patio and answered only what she asked. "You can come closer," she said. I spent 31 years telling technicians not to breathe on a setup after recording began. Patio is fine. She tested the controller output, then the fence at specified points, and under the stated resistance. She checked the ground system, pulse interval, pulse energy, warning signs, setback, and shutoff. One sign near the rear corner sat slightly lower than the installation plan. She noted it and asked that it be raised 2 inches for visibility. I raised it. That minor correction mattered to me. A report finding absolutely nothing is often treated like advocacy. A report that records a small real defect and still finds the system compliant looks like what it is, an inspection. The inspector measured my actual system at the stated load, recorded pulse energy and interval, checked the grounding, signs, setback, gate shutoff, and controller listing. It passed. Finally, Priya preserved the portal audit history. Section 7.4, a new prohibition on energized residential fencing, had been uploaded 17 days after my first violation notice and approved at a board meeting after the fines had begun. We now had 3 lines of defense. The HOA's measurement belonged to its own controller. My controller passed a direct neutral inspection. Its backup rule did not exist when the alleged violation began. Priya arranged them in that order. Identity first. Actual safety second. Rule timing last. The trick was not hiding evidence from the court. Everything had been disclosed properly. The trick was allowing the HOA to finish describing the ladder before we showed where it was leaning. The night before the hearing, Priya rehearsed the sequence with me. What if they withdraw Exhibit 4? Then the emergency claim loses its measurement. What if they say it was only representative? Then the admission contradicts them. What if they say the controllers are equivalent? Ask Martin whether he can reach that conclusion without testing EF 8841. What if Allison pivots to section 7.4, portal log? What if the judge dislikes electric fences? That was the only question without a document for an answer. Then we make it easy to rule narrowly, I said. This is not about whether every electric fence is beautiful. It is whether their emergency evidence measures mine. Priya closed the folder. You realize most clients ask me to destroy the other side. Calibration is more modest. We identify the error and report the uncertainty. That sentence is why nobody has made a courtroom television series about calibration. At the hearing, Allison testified first. She identified my fence photographs, the violation notice, and the cropped North Ridge page. Priya asked only whether Exhibit 4 represented a measurement taken from my installed fence. Yes, Allison said, that is what our consultant provided. And the association relied on 9.7 kilovolts as evidence of an emergency? Absolutely. The word absolutely is useful when the facts are strong. When they are not, it becomes a receipt. Martin Cole testified next. He explained that his meter was calibrated and that the recorded reading was accurate under the stated load. The HOA attorney stopped there. For several minutes, their case looked excellent. Photographs, a consultant, a calibrated instrument, and a number large enough to require a comma. The HOA attorney also asked Martin whether improper electric fencing could create a risk. Yes. Whether direct contact should be controlled. Yes. Whether installation details mattered. Yes. Those answers were all true. That made them effective. A weak case does not always consist of lies. Sometimes it consists of true sentences, arranged so that the missing sentence does all the work. The missing sentence was, "Which installation did you test?" Priya stood. She did not ask whether 9.7 kilovolts sounded frightening. She did not ask Martin to agree that the HOA was dishonest. She asked him to identify the complete report, then directed him to the appendix. Please read the controller serial, EF 7712. And the test location? Martin glanced toward Allison before answering. The association maintenance yard. Priya let the answer sit. She did not turn toward the judge or look at me. A dramatic pause announces that counsel believes something dramatic has happened. A normal pause gives everyone time to read the page. The judge looked at Exhibit 4. The maintenance yard is not Mr. Reyes's address? No, Your Honor, Martin said. How far away is it? Approximately 6/10 of a mile. The HOA attorney stood and said the equipment was comparable. The judge nodded. You may establish that if you can. That was not the rescue it sounded like. Comparable was a technical conclusion, and the HOA had called the one witness professionally obligated not to invent it. Priya introduced my SafeLine certificate. What is the serial of Mr. Reyes's controller? EF 8841. Then she introduced the HOA's invoice. What equipment was installed at the maintenance yard? EF 7712. The courtroom did not erupt. Real courtrooms rarely do. The judge removed her glasses and reread the 2 pages. The HOA attorney leaned toward Allison. Martin waited with the weary patience of a man discovering that his appendix had developed a legal career without consulting him. Priya asked Martin whether he had entered my property. No. Whether anyone from North Ridge had connected a meter to my fence. Not according to our file. Whether his work order requested a test of my system. Number. It requested a representative output demonstration using association equipment. Whether the complete report warned that no conclusion about my installation could be made without direct testing. Yes. Allison's attorney objected that both controllers came from the same manufacturer and product family. The judge allowed a limited question. Mr. Cole, can the result from EF 7712 establish the safety condition of EF 8841? No. He explained that electric fence output depends on controller configuration, stated resistance, fence length, vegetation load, grounding, soil conditions, wiring, pulse energy, and pulse duration. Peak voltage alone was not a complete safety conclusion. 2 gray housings could contain differently configured systems. This was unfortunate for Allison, whose technical theory had become the boxes look alike. Priya displayed the cropped page beside the full report. The crop removed the site, controller serial, stated load details, scope limitation, and the sentence saying my installation had not been tested. My yard photographs had been placed beneath the remaining chart. Did Northridge prepare this combined page? No. Would you use it to conclude that Mr. Reyes's fence produced 9.7 kilovolts? No. Priya then returned to the number itself. Does 9.7 kilovolts, standing alone, tell the court whether this pulsed system is unsafe? No. Why not? Voltage is one parameter. I would need the test load, output energy, pulse duration, pulse interval, grounding, fence condition, controller configuration, and installation context. Did your full report call EF7712 unsafe? No. We recorded the comparison measurement requested. That answer removed the final piece of theatrical decoration. The HOA had not only used its own fence, it had converted a neutral measurement of that fence into a safety conclusion the consultant himself had never made. Allison whispered something to counsel. Priya waited. The silence was not triumphant. It was administrative. The sound a room makes when everyone realizes the next 10 minutes will involve locating the correct version of a document. Allison tried to explain that the page was illustrative. Priya handed her the admission bearing the word admitted. Illustrative of what? For the first time, Allison did not have a prepared noun. The HOA retreated to safety in general. Priya called the neutral inspector, who authenticated the direct test of EF8841. He had photographed both serials, used a calibrated meter, stated the resistance, recorded peak voltage, pulse energy and interval, and inspected the grounding, signs, setback, and gate shutoff. My system complied with the applicable installation and controller requirements. The inspector did not call it harmless, because competent people do not describe electrical equipment with bedtime story vocabulary. He called it properly configured and compliant. The HOA then pivoted to Section 7.4. This was our third line, and the least theatrical. Portal audit logs are not naturally charismatic. Ours showed that Section 7.4 had been uploaded 17 days after the first notice. The board minutes showed the vote occurred after fines had already started. Priya kept the explanation short. The HOA could consider a properly noticed prospective rule. It could not manufacture the authority for an earlier violation after issuing it, then use the new text to preserve the old fines. The judge asked Allison why the first notice called the fence prohibited if the prohibition had not yet been adopted. Allison said the board had always understood energized fencing to be inconsistent with community standards. That answer probably felt safer before the written approval was placed beside it. Ellen's email said, "Approved as submitted under current exterior improvement standards." There are moments when a long argument loses to a sentence written by someone trying to clear her inbox before lunch. The HOA's attorney made one final practical argument. Even if the first notice was defective, he said, the board should be allowed to require removal now under its newly adopted rule. Priya answered that the emergency petition before the court sought to enforce the existing violation, fines, lien, and immediate removal on the record the HOA had presented. A future enforcement decision under a valid prospective rule would require its own notice, process, and consideration of my prior written approval. The court did not need to decide a hypothetical future dispute to decide whether this one was supported. That was exactly the narrow path we had prepared. We were not asking the judge to bless every possible use of electric fencing. We were asking her not to order removal based on a measurement from another address and a rule written after the accusation. The judge denied emergency removal. She found that Exhibit 4 did not report a measurement of my system, and that the association's presentation of it lacked the context necessary to establish the claimed hazard. The direct neutral test contradicted the emergency theory. She also ruled that the later Section 7.4 could not retroactively support the original violation, accumulated fines, or lien. Those were voided. The HOA had to correct my account and release the lien. Priya could submit the limited request for costs and fees allowed by the governing documents and procedure. The judge did not ban the HOA from regulating fences forever. She said any future rule had to be adopted with proper notice and applied prospectively. That mattered. I had not gone to court to become the neighborhood's unelected minister of electricity. I wanted the approval honored and the evidence used honestly. Outside, Priya asked whether I had enjoyed the moment Martin read EF 7712. Professionally, I said, that is not an emotion. It is in calibration. The board commissioned an independent inspection of the maintenance yard fence. It was not torn down in disgrace. Its 9.7 kilovolt loaded reading was not automatically illegal. Once evaluated with its configuration, energy, grounding, load conditions, signs, and isolated location, the system required only routine maintenance and updated documentation. That outcome made the point better than a dramatic demolition would have. The number had never been the villain. The substitution was. At the next regular meeting, the board removed Allison as architectural committee chair by an ordinary vote. She remained on the board. Nobody was arrested. Nobody confessed into a live microphone. The snowman at the maintenance yard continued judging traffic. The HOA adopted a review policy requiring complete consultant reports to remain attached when used in enforcement. It also proposed a prospective residential wildlife fence standard, covering setbacks, signs, approved pulse controllers, inspection access, and shutoffs. I submitted comments. They accepted 2 and ignored 3, which is about as close as neighborhood government gets to reconciliation. Ellen, the community manager, called after the account correction posted. She apologized for not catching the altered report package before it went into the court filing. I believed her. Community managers process whatever boards hand them, usually while answering questions about pool keys and explaining that the landscaping crew cannot negotiate personally with every hydrangea. She also restored the original approval and the neutral inspection to my permanent property file. That was more useful than an elaborate apology. In an HOA, remorse fades. A correctly indexed PDF can live forever. Allison and I did not become friends. A few weeks later, she walked past while I was replacing an irrigation line. She stopped at the edge of the driveway and asked whether the fence was still operating. Yes. The board will probably revisit the standard next year. That's their option. She nodded toward the orchard. The trees look better. The deer have become strong supporters of personal boundaries. She almost smiled. Then she remembered who I was and continued walking. That exchange was enough. She had lost the committee chair, not her house or her place in the community. I had kept my fence, not received a license to humiliate her indefinitely. The most useful consequence was that future enforcement packets now had to include complete reports, and another homeowner would not need a calibration background to ask where a number came from. My fence stayed. The peach trees recovered. Benny resumed his slow patrols, pausing at each warning sign as if checking that management had finally posted the proper paperwork. People later asked how I knew the HOA had tested its own fence. I did not know at first. I noticed that the page could not identify what had been tested. Then I offered a transparent test and watched the HOA refuse it. I made them commit to a precise claim. Only after that did we request the chain that could prove or disprove it. That was the real counterattack. It was not a surprise statute or a magical deadline. It was a sequence: offer verification, preserve identity, lock the claim, demand the complete record, trace the serial, and let the claimant authenticate its own mistake. 9.7 kilovolts sounded like the whole case because it was the largest number in the room. But a number becomes evidence only when you know which device produced it, where it was measured, under what load, and by what method. The HOA had a real number. It simply belonged to the fence they drove past every morning on the way to accuse me of mine.